At 06:15 on July 30th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Michael Arooth crawled into the tail position of B-17 Tondelayo at RAF Kimbolton, watching a gray English dawn that would carry him 500 miles into Germany. 24 years old, 12 combat missions, 3 confirmed kills. The Luftwaffe had positioned over 300 fighters along the route to Kassel. Arooth settled onto the bicycle seat that served as his workstation. The tail gunner position measured 4 ft wide and 5 ft long. 2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, pointed backward through a plexiglass window. At $25,000 FT, the temperature outside would drop to 60° F. His electrically heated suit was the only thing between survival and death by hypothermia. The 8th Air Force called it the loneliest job in the war. The tail gunner worked alone, separated from the rest of the crew by 40 ft of aluminum fuselage. No one to talk to, no one to help if something went wrong. Just a man, 2 guns, and whatever the Luftwaffe sent his way. The statistics told the story. In the summer of 1943, the average B-17 crew survived 11 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. Tail gunners died faster than anyone except ball turret gunners. German fighter pilots preferred attacking from the rear. The tail position absorbed the first bullets. By July, the 379th Bombardment Group had already lost 9 aircraft in just 2 months of operations. 90 men gone. The problem was geometry. German pilots understood that approaching from behind gave them the longest possible firing window. A Messerschmitt Bf-109, closing at 350 meters from the 6th position, had nearly 10 seconds to aim and fire before passing the bomber. The tail gunner had those same 10 seconds to hit a target, moving at combined speeds approaching 600 mph. Most tail gunners never got the chance. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 carried 2 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. A single burst could shred the plexiglass bubble, kill the gunner, and disable the tail. Controls. Bombers without tail protection became easy targets. The fighters would circle back, line up, and finish the job. The standard Army Air Force's gunnery training taught gunners to wait, conserve ammunition, fire only at ranges under 300 yards. The theory made sense in a classroom. In combat, 300 yards meant the enemy was already shooting. By the time a tail gunner opened fire, he might already be dead. Arooth had watched it happen on his 6th mission, a B-17 flying off. Tondelayo's right wing took a direct hit to the tail section. The gunner never fired a shot. The fighter came in fast, guns blazing, and the first rounds punched through the plexiglass before the American could react. The bomber fell out of formation, trailing smoke. 8 parachutes emerged. The tail gunner was not among them. The official doctrine demanded patience. Arooth questioned everything about it. The fighters attacked from maximum range because they knew American gunners would hold fire. The Luftwaffe pilots had learned the patterns. They exploited the training manual like a roadmap. If you want to see how Arooth challenged the doctrine that was getting tail gunners killed, please hit that like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Arooth. 186 B-17s lifted off from bases across eastern England that morning. 123 P-47. Thunderbolts would escort them partway, but fuel limitations meant the fighters would turn. Back over Belgium. The bombers would fly the final 200 miles to Kassel alone. Arooth checked his ammunition belts. 400 rounds per gun, 800 total. The manual said that was enough for a standard mission. Arooth had already decided the manual was wrong about everything else. By noon, he would find out if he was right. The cost of being wrong was a closed casket funeral and a telegram to his family. The formation crossed the English Channel at 14,000 Tatuleft. Still climbing, Arooth watched the E. Water recede through his plexiglass window, the white cliffs of Dover shrinking to a pale line on the horizon. Ahead lay occupied France, then Belgium, then the heart of Nazi Germany. The P-47 escorts held position around the bomber stream. Their presence meant safety, but Arooth knew the arithmetic. The Thunderbolts carried enough fuel for roughly 90 minutes of combat flying. The mission to Kassel would take 6 hours. For most of the journey, the bombers would fly alone. Arooth had spent his first missions following doctrine. Wait for the fighter to close, aim carefully, fire in short bursts, conserve ammunition. The training instructors at gunnery school had drilled it into every student. Ammunition was limited. Accuracy mattered more than volume. A disciplined gunner could make 800 rounds last an entire mission. The doctrine assumed the enemy would cooperate. The Luftwaffe did not. German pilots had studied American tactics. They knew the gunners waited until 300 yards, so they opened fire at 600 yards, pouring cannon shells into the bomber formations while the Americans held their triggers. By the time the tail gunners started shooting, the damage was already done. Arooth had calculated the problem differently. A Focke-Wulf FW-190 at 600 yards was not a difficult target. It was flying straight toward him, nose pointed directly at his position, presenting the largest possible profile. The closure rate meant the apparent size doubled every few seconds. A gunner who started firing early could walk his tracers onto the target, adjusting aim as the range decreased. The risk was ammunition. 800 rounds sounded like a lot until you divided it by the number of attacking fighters. A mission might see 15, 20, even 30 separate attacks. At 50 rounds per burst, the mathematics turned brutal. A gunner who fired early might run dry before the mission ended. Arooth accepted the WWII trade-off. A gunner who conserved ammunition but died on the third attack had made a poor bargain. Survival required disrupting the enemy's attack before it succeeded. If that meant running low on bullets, he would deal with that problem later. Dead men had no use for reserve ammunition. His first test came on his fourth mission, a raid against submarine pens at St. Nazaire in June. A pair of Bf-109s approached from the six-way low position. The classic tail attack. Standard. Doctrine said, wait. Arooth opened fire at 700 yards. The tracers arced across the sky, falling short at first, then climbing toward the lead fighter. The German pilot saw the fire coming and broke off his attack, diving away before reaching effective cannon range. His wingman followed. Neither fighter scored a hit on Tondelayo. The crew chief questioned Arooth after landing. The ammunition count showed he had expended nearly 200 rounds on a single engagement. At that rate, he would run out, before reaching targets deep inside Germany. Arooth explained his reasoning. The crew chief remained skeptical. Other tail gunners heard about the incident. Some called it reckless. Wasting ammunition on long-range shots violated everything the Army Air Forces taught. The training manuals existed for reasons. Arooth was gambling with his crew's lives. But Tondelayo kept coming home. Mission after mission, the bomber returned to Kimbolton with its crew intact. Other aircraft in the 527th Squadron were not so fortunate. By mid-July, 3 bombers from the squadron had gone down. 30 men lost. Now crossing into Belgium on July 30th, Arooth watched the P-47 escorts waggle their wings and turn back toward England. The fuel gauges in the Thunderbolts demanded retreat. The bombers pressed on alone. Somewhere ahead, 300 German fighters were waiting. Arooth would need every round he had. He would also need to survive long enough to use them. The first Messerschmitts appeared at 11:42, climbing from the southeast in groups of 4. Arooth counted 8, then 12, then stopped counting. The sky behind Tondelayo filled with black crosses on yellow noses. The lead fighter began its attack run from the 6-Wang high position, diving toward the bomber formation at 400 mm. Arooth tracked the aircraft through his gun sight, watching the wingspan grow larger with each passing second. At 800 yards, he squeezed both triggers. The twin Brownings roared to life, sending a stream of tracers across the sky. The first rounds fell short, disappearing into empty air below the diving fighter. Arooth adjusted, walking the fire upward. At 600 yards, the tracers began connecting. Bright flashes sparked along the Messerschmitt's engine cowling. The German pilot broke hard right, smoke trailing from his aircraft. He never completed his firing pass. The fighter spiraled downward, disappearing into the cloud layer below. Arooth had no time to watch. The second attacker was already closing. This one came in lower, trying to slip beneath Arooth's field of fire. The angle was difficult, requiring him to depress his guns nearly to their mechanical limit. He fired anyway, sending a long burst toward the approaching fighter. The Focke-Wulf pilot flinched, pulling up early and releasing his cannon shells into empty sky above Tondelayo. The attacks continued for 47 minutes. Wave after wave of German fighters slashed through the bomber formation, targeting stragglers and damaged aircraft. Arooth fired at everything that came within range, burning through ammunition at 3 times the recommended rate. His gun barrels glowed red from sustained fire. At 12:29, a Bf-109 approached from directly astern, flying straight and level. The pilot had either extraordinary courage or poor judgment. Arooth centered the fighter in his gun sight, and held the triggers down. The Brownings hammered for 6 continuous seconds, pouring over 100 rounds into the approaching aircraft. The Messerschmitt disintegrated. The engine separated from the fuselage. The wings folded backward. What remained of the fighter tumbled past Tondelayo, close enough for Arooth to see the empty cockpit. The pilot had either ejected or died at the controls. 2 confirmed kills. Ammunition down to 180 rounds. The formation reached Kassel at 12:51 and began its bombing run. For 11 minutes, the bombers flew straight and level, unable to maneuver while the bombardiers lined up their targets. The Luftwaffe knew this moment represented maximum vulnerability. The fighters pressed their attacks with renewed fury. A Focke-Wulf 190 Dove on Tondelayo from the 5 Ulu position. Arooth swung his guns to meet it, firing a short burst. The rounds struck the fighter's wing root. The pilot kept coming. Cannon shells tearing through Tondelayo's tail section. Arooth felt the impacts before he felt the pain. 20 mm fragments ripped through the plexiglass, shredding his flight suit and burying themselves in his left arm and shoulder. His left gun jammed. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the compartment. He kept firing with the right gun, one-handed, bleeding. He tracked the wounded FW-190 as it pulled away. A final burst caught the fighter's tail assembly. The aircraft snap-rolled and, dove toward the ground. His 3rd kill of the mission. The intercom crackled with voices from the crew. Someone was asking about damage. Someone else reported flak ahead. Arooth tried to respond, but his throat had gone dry. Blood pooled on the floor of his compartment, freezing almost instantly in the sub-zero air. 400 rounds expended. 63 remaining. 3 German fighters destroyed, and the mission was only half over. Tondelayo still had to fly 250 miles back to England through the same gauntlet of fighters that had nearly killed him on the way in. Arooth wrapped a scarf around his wounded arm and waited for the next attack. The return flight began at 13:04. Tondelayo turned westward with 185 other bombers, leaving Kassel burning beneath a column of black smoke. Arooth remained at his position, scanning the sky through blood-smeared plexiglass. The Luftwaffe was not finished. German fighters regrouped over Belgium, positioning themselves along the bomber stream's route to the English Channel. Fresh aircraft replaced those lost or damaged in the morning attacks. The second gauntlet would be as dangerous as the first. Arooth's left arm had gone numb from the cold and the wounds. His jammed gun remained inoperable, the feed mechanism shattered by the same cannon shell that had injured him. He had 1 functioning weapon and 63 rounds of ammunition to cover 250 miles of hostile airspace. The mathematics demanded a different approach. At 63 rounds, he could afford perhaps 3 engagements of 20 rounds each. Every trigger pull had to count. The luxury of suppressive fire was gone. At 13:31, a pair of Bf-109s closed from the 7-0 position. Arooth waited until 500 yards, then fired a precise 12-round burst at the lead fighter. The tracers struck the engine cowling. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and dove away, trailing glycol coolant. The wingman broke off without attacking. 51 rounds remaining. Tondelayo crossed into France at 14:15. The fighter attacks diminished as the Luftwaffe reached the limit of their operational range. By 14:47, the bomber formation had outrun the last German interceptors. The English Channel appeared on the horizon 20 minutes later. The landing at Kimballton came at 15:52. Arooth could not climb out of his compartment without assistance. Ground crew pulled him through the narrow hatch and carried him to a waiting ambulance. The flight surgeon counted 11 separate fragment wounds in his arm, shoulder, and upper back. Word spread through the 379th Bombardment Group. Within hours, the tail gunner on Tondelayo had scored 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables while wounded, operating a single gun with 63 rounds of ammunition. The mission intelligence report noted his early engagement technique as a contributing factor to the bomber's survival. Other tale. Gunners began asking questions. The standard doctrine said, wait until 300 yards. Arooth had opened fire at 800. The doctrine said conserve ammunition. Arooth had burned through 700 rounds before getting hit. The doctrine produced dead gunners. Arooth was still alive. The 527th Squadron's gunnery officer reviewed the combat footage from Tondelayo's mission. The gun camera showed Arooth's tracers reaching out far beyond normal engagement range, disrupting attack runs before the German pilots could establish firing solutions. The early fire forced the enemy to maneuver, degrading their accuracy and reducing hits on the bomber. By mid-August, 3 other tail gunners in the squadron had adopted variations of Arooth's technique. Their survival rates improved. The bombers they protected returned with less damage. The correlation was difficult to ignore. The 379th Group Commander received a preliminary report on September 1st. The data suggested that aggressive early fire reduced bomber casualties by disrupting coordinated fighter attacks. The implications challenged 2 years of established gunnery doctrine. Meanwhile, Arooth recovered from his wounds at the station hospital. The fragment damage had missed major blood vessels and nerves. The flight surgeon cleared him for duty on August 19th, 3 weeks after the Kassel mission. Tondelayo had a new aircraft waiting. The old bomber had been written off after accumulating too much battle damage for economical repair. The replacement carried the same name and the same crew. Arooth climbed back into the tail position on August 26th. The Luftwaffe had noticed something changing in the American bomber formations. Their intelligence officers were studying the problem. Luftwaffe intelligence officers noticed the pattern in early September. American tail gunners were opening fire earlier, sometimes at ranges exceeding 600 yards. The change disrupted attack formations that had worked reliably for months. German fighter pilots reported the shift in debriefings across occupied Europe. The approach from Siksk, once the safest angle against B-17 formations, was becoming increasingly dangerous. Tracers reached out before pilots could establish stable firing platforms. The psychological effect was significant. A pilot watching tracers stream toward his aircraft at long range instinctively maneuvered even when the rounds were falling short. The Luftwaffe's tactical response came in 3 phases. First, they increased approach speeds, diving on bomber formations at maximum velocity to reduce exposure time. Second, they shifted attack angles, approaching from the high six-sweep position where gravity would assist their pullout. Third, they began targeting specific aircraft that appeared to have aggressive gunners, hoping to eliminate the threat before it could spread. None of these adaptations solved the fundamental problem. Faster approaches meant less accurate shooting. Steeper angles increased the difficulty of tracking targets through the dive. Targeting aggressive gunners required identifying them in advance, which was nearly impossible in the chaos of a running air battle. The 379th Bombardment Group flew 11 missions between August 26th and September 5th. Arooth participated in 4 of them, adding confirmed kills to his record. Other tail gunners in the group claimed additional victories. The Luftwaffe's loss ratio against the Triangle K bombers was climbing. German fighter commanders tried concentrating their attacks. Instead of spreading interceptors across the entire bomber stream, they massed against single groups, hoping to overwhelm defensive fire through sheer numbers. The tactic produced results on certain missions, but the 379th escaped some of the worst losses by flying in different positions within the combat box. But the lesson was clear. The Luftwaffe was adapting, searching for weaknesses in the new defensive approach. The air war over Europe had become a contest of tactical innovation, with each side studying the other's methods and developing countermeasures. Arooth understood the stakes. His technique worked because it surprised the enemy. Once the Germans developed effective responses, the advantage would disappear. Every mission was a test, every engagement a data point that both sides would analyze. The temporary edge that aggressive fire provided was eroding with each passing week. The mission scheduled for September 6th would target Stuttgart, deep in southern Germany. The route would carry the bombers over 500 miles of enemy territory, the longest penetration the 8th Air Force had attempted that month. Intelligence predicted heavy fighter opposition from bases in France, Belgium, and Germany itself. Stuttgart manufactured ball bearings, components essential to every vehicle, aircraft, and weapon in the German arsenal. The strategic importance made it one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. Flak batteries ringed the city. Fighter squadrons were positioned along every likely approach route. The briefing on September 5th laid out the challenge. The 379th would fly in the lead.
Position of the combat wing, responsible for navigation and bomb aiming for the formations following behind. Lead position meant absorbing the first fighter attacks. It meant flying straight and level while other groups maneuvered. It meant maximum exposure to everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. Arooth checked his guns that evening. Both Brownings were freshly serviced, the feed mechanism smooth, the barrels replaced after accumulating too many rounds. He loaded
extra ammunition beyond the standard 800. The extra weight seemed less important than firepower. Tomorrow would test everything he had learned. Tomorrow would determine whether his methods could survive the most dangerous mission of his career. The Stuttgart mission launched at 0540 on September 6th. 187 bombers climbed into an overcast English sky, forming up over the North Sea before turning southeast toward occupied Europe. Tondelayo flew in the lead element of the 379th Formation, positioned where Arooth would face the first attacks from any direction. The fighters found them over France at 09:15. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs rose from airfields across the region, climbing to intercept the bomber stream before it reached German airspace. The initial attacks came from head-on positions, testing the nose gunners rather than the tail. Arooth waited, watching contrails multiply behind the formation. The Luftwaffe was building strength, assembling fighters from multiple units into a concentrated force. By 0940, intelligence estimates counted over 100 interceptors tracking the bombers.